3.5 of that breed. There's still names that I see in stock horses and things which directly link back to the horse that the Robinsons decided to hypercharge their breeding program with. James Robinson, who was the old fella here in 1878, he was the benefactor of the Gundagai racetrack, donating the land and establishing the racing club. He also served as the inaugural chairman and maintained that position for a very long time thereafter. His son Wallace Robinson was also a keen race man, also the chairman of the racing club, and was interested in both racing and in the breeding of racehorses. In the late 1880s, he secured Dunlop. Now, Dunlop was a dual Caulfield Melbourne Cup winner in 1887, and he was bought by the Robinsons to facilitate an extensive horse breeding program here at the farm, most probably in the paddock over there, which is called the horse paddock. Dunwell and Dunmore being two of the best bred from that Dunlop sire, who went on themselves to be good stallions. Now, Wallace Robinson was also the owner of the famous De Maistre racing colours. Evian De Maistre was essentially the Bart Cummings of the colony at the time. He's still second to Bart in Melbourne Cups won with 5, and third with most cups won by an owner with 4 wins. And the all black colours were probably the most famous at the time, as they were the colours worn by Archer, who went back to back in the first 2 Melbourne Cups in 1861 and 62. And he probably would have won a third without the scandal of the 1863 Melbourne Cup. De Maistre's form arrived a bit late because of a public holiday that was happening in Victoria, which doesn't surprise me. And the horse was not allowed to run. The scratching of Archer caused nearly all the other runners to forfeit the race in protest, and only 7 runners took part in that race, the smallest field ever. De Maistre went on to win 3 more Melbourne Cups with Tim Whiffler in 67, which is another funny story because there are actually 2 Tim Whifflers in that race, because it was named after a poem from an earlier year. So Tim Whiffler, New South Wales, won that cup in 67, Chester in 1877, and Calamai in 1878. When Evian De Maistre retired, he transferred his colours to Wallace Robinson, and thus the most famous racing colours of the colonies belonged to Kaimau Estate, proudly raced by the Robinson family of Kaimau for many years. Wallace fell ill himself as a relatively young man, but on his deathbed in 1915, one of his biggest concerns were about those famous colours and where they would go upon his passing. He wrote to the Sydney Mail's famous Milroy, whom he knew was a racing man, to find a worthy new owner, and was quoted as saying in that letter that he didn't want the colours of the colony's greatest sportsman to end up in the hands of some pony doper. And I'm pleased to announce that the colours have since now returned to the De Maistre family, because I rang up to try and buy them a couple of years ago. And hopefully when we get a runner or 2, Pete, we might be able to lease them back from the De Maistre family and complete the circle. The Robinson family of Kaimau was also instrumental in bringing the legendary Australian racehorse and Melbourne Cup winner Phar Lap Body back to Australia from the United States. Mr. Robinson formed a syndicate of businessmen, and a few mates, and facilitated the return of Phar Lap Body back to Australia. The famous saddlecloth from the last race is a token of that syndicate, and it remains in the Gundagai Museum today, well worth a visit. The Greater Region has also been home to other Cup winners. Night March in 1929, one of the most unpopular wins of all time because he beat home Phar Lap for the Cup. He was bred and trained, I believe, just in the back of Barambula, between Barambula and Detroit, essentially. Now, also just across the river at Barambula, a fine horse breeding operation was established by F.W. Hughes, who was a bit of an Australian success story. He was a farmhand who turned into a wool valuer and eventually bought out his boss's business and became a very successful industrialist in his own right. Bought several properties around the country and got into horse racing in his later years. And in 13 years of racing, Mr. Hughes had 270 winners from his 13 years of racing, including the 1947 Melbourne Cup with Haraji. Now, Barambula Wines here today, and they've got a nice red, which is named after Haraji, with a little bit of information on the back of the label. So I'd like to welcome all of you here today and extend my thanks to the special guests of Como today. We've got members and board members of the Gundagai and the Murrumbidgee Turf Clubs. Thank you guys for being here. Terrific for your support. Steph Cook was trying to be here today, but she broke down yesterday. So they haven't put her down, but she's on crutches. And couldn't make it. The other apology is Michael McCormack. I know he's a real local racing history enthusiast, and he's very disappointed that he had a clash in his calendar. But what we do have here today, so we've got Des Gleeson. I won't go too much because I don't want to steal Jackson's thunder, but he is a legendary figure in horse racing in Australia, 35-year devoted servant to the betterment of racing in Australia as a steward. And I think this quote from an article upon the announcement of his retirement says it pretty well. Des is widely regarded one of this country's greatest ever stewards. He is highly respected in all parts of the industry and has led the evolution of the integrity of racing in this state. His professional relationships across the industry with jockeys, trainers, medias and administrators at all levels have been a hallmark of his communication skills and the respect with which he is held. We are honoured to have Des with us today. James Tate's also here with us today. Now, James is a member of the horse racing aristocracy of our area, being an esteemed member of the Tate family. Breeding, training, owning, race calling. The Tate family's connection to horse racing goes back over 100 years, and their legacy still continues today. So thank you for joining us today as well, James. I'm going to pass you over to Jackson from the VRC to continue.
Perfect, thanks David. As well. So this is actually the 21st running of the Lexus Melbourne Cup Tour, which kicked off in 2003 when Maccabi Diva took her first victory. Since then we've been running the Cup Tour. We do an application system every year and communities all around the world in Australia have the chance to apply. This year we had a record number of applications with 99 different communities around Australia and the world applying. I'd love to travel the Cup for 8 months of the year, but unfortunately that's not viable. So we have to dwindle that down to a list of 41 for this year, of which there's 7 countries. So we have Australia, New Zealand, we've just recently gotten back from Europe, so we're in the UK, Ireland, France. We kicked off the tour in Japan in June, and we have Hong Kong in a few weeks' time. As well as that, it's a huge community initiative running the Cup Tour. As you heard from David earlier, the connection that communities have from all around Australia is so important. That's why we come back to these places to pay respects and bring out those memories. Since the tour's inception in 2003, the Cup has travelled 900,000 kilometres. We've visited over 590 destinations and along the way engaged with tens of thousands of people and communities. Also running fundraiser initiatives along the way. Now to the Cup behind me. We have a few different names for the Cup other than being the Cup. The first we call is the People's Cup, and as I mentioned earlier, look, us at the VRC, we put on the race, but it wouldn't have the engagement and the popularity that it would if it didn't touch the communities all around Australia, New Zealand and the world. So we really like to call it the People's Cup and bring it around and give people the opportunity to take photos with it and share some stories as well. The other name we have for the Cup is the Loving Cup. The term the Loving Cup is used to describe a cup that has 3 handles. And in this situation, we use it to symbolise the relationship between the jockey, the trainer and the owner. Now the Cup itself, it's mined from Newcrest Mine in Orange, New South Wales. It starts as 44 hand-beaten pieces of gold. It's then transported to ABC Bullion, who make our cup for us, where it goes through a rigorous process where it's smelted, whacked into place, spun and polished, and it gives us the final product we have here. That process takes about 250 hours to complete the cup and get it in the form that we see today. The cup itself weighs 3.8 kilos. 1.65 of that is 18 karat gold. It's very soft. If you get up close to it, you can see it scratches very easily. We have to get the cup polished about 3 times from June all the way through to November, and particularly just before the first Tuesday in November as well, so it's looking beautiful for their new owners. We have 6 different trophies that are presented on the day. So this trophy here is our main trophy. This actually goes to the owners. We then have 4 smaller trophies, about half to 2/3 of the size. One of them goes to the jockey, one goes to the breeder, one goes to the strapper, and one goes to the trainer. The other trophy that we also present on the day goes to the jockey, and is a Harry White whip, which is a gold-plated whip that looks amazing. Which is in memory of Harry White, who took out the cup a few times. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Des and James up, and we'll kick off a Q&A. Perfect. Des, 35 years Chief of Stewards. What sort of is the day-to-day role of a steward? You can go through that, and also, what processes do you have to go through for a carnival? I know you have international horses come out and they have to quarantine at Werribee. What does that sort of look like? And I'm assuming it's a lot busier than a normal day at the races.
It certainly is. Sorry. Yeah, it certainly is, Jackson, and thanks very much for giving us the opportunity to be in this beautiful part of the world. We feel like we're home at the horse racing country up here. It is delightful to be here. But yes, I was a steward for 35 years, and basically the steward's role is to see that racing is run fairly, so that every participant, particularly the owners who pay lots and lots of money to get horses to the stage of racing, that they get a fair run for their money and that racing is conducted on an equal playing field. The stewards basically have to ensure that the riders are licensed, for example, the trainers are also licensed, that the horses are registered, and their day-to-day operations on race day are there to ensure that the rules of racing are complied with. And the rules of racing require riders to ride within the rules, cause as little interference as possible in races, so that the owners get an opportunity to win the races without being hindered by interference caused by rider carelessness. The steward's role leading into the carnival is far more significant now that the Melbourne Cup is rated the #1 handicap race in the world because of the international involvement. And racing is not like any other sport. Cricket, for example, have international rules. Soccer has international rules. Golf has international rules. Racing doesn't have international rules. Every racing jurisdiction has their own set of rules which differ significantly from racing jurisdiction to racing jurisdiction. So when we get nominations for the Melbourne Cup, and we do get significant international nominations, the steward's role basically firstly is to prepare a booklet with all the rules that apply here in Australia and send it to the trainers of the horses that are nominated, so that at least they have an understanding when they get here of what's required. And the rules are significantly different in relation to drugs that are permitted to be given to horses. In Australia, there's no race day treatment permitted. That's not the case in other jurisdictions. In case of alcoholising agents are not permitted to be given within 2 days of racing, and that's not the case in other jurisdictions. Gear rules are different from country to country, so it's important that the trainers are fully aware of what's required when they do get here. And the same applies to riders. Riders' rules are different in relation to whip use, in relation to drugs that riders are permitted to have in their system when they're riding. Protest rules are different, so riders have to be familiarised with what's required out here in Australia. For example, in England, riders don't lodge objections. The stewards do. Here in Australia, the stewards have the power to lodge their objections, but certainly if the rider feels that he's been hampered in any way and it's affected the result of the race, the riders are encouraged to lodge objections, which doesn't happen in any other or many other jurisdictions. The gear that riders use are different, which is extraordinary really. We have rules here in relation to jockeys' helmets, for example, that there is a standard in Australia that they're required to wear, which is different to the standards in England and Ireland and Japan and Hong Kong. So oddly, when riders come out here from those countries, we don't let them wear their normal helmets because they don't comply with the Australian standards. So we send them up to Jerry Harlan, probably on race eve, and they get a helmet that doesn't really suit them, but it does comply with Australian standards, and the same as whips. Back particularly in 1993 when Vintage Crop came out here, the riders in England had long padded whips, which fortunately we have now, and we had these smaller whips which were used incorrectly could inflict more damage on a horse than the whips that were able to be used in England. So we need to familiarise everybody with the rules that are required out here. It's too late once the race has been run for them to find out what the rules are. They must know beforehand. And another highlight, when Delta Blues and Pop Rock Cornell the Melbourne Cup in 1996, the year before, the Japanese contingent brought a horse called Eye-Popper out here. And because they couldn't speak English and we couldn't speak Japanese, they had an interpreter with them, and we were trying to get through the interpreter, who wasn't the brightest spark in the shed, I can tell you, but to get the message across to the Japanese contingent was quite difficult. And then you wouldn't believe it, on race day, one of the stewards noticed the connections of Eye-Popper administering a cream to the horse's hock. It had grazed its hock on the way to the races, and they were administering this cream onto the graze. But it's against the rules in Australia to do that without the steward's permission, and we would probably give permission if the veterinary surgeon examined what the product was and it was going to benefit the horse. But they didn't get permission because in Japan you could do it. So we then needed to establish exactly what was in that cream, because if you would give a cream that's got a banned substance in it to an open graze on a horse, it would be quickly absorbed into the horse's bloodstream, and if the horse was swabbed after the cup, it would return a positive swab. So we needed to urgently find out what was in that particular substance that was given to the horse. And this was an hour before the Melbourne Cup. So we got the trainer, we couldn't find his interpreter, he disappeared into the ether. So we had the trainer and the owner and connections who didn't understand us, and we didn't understand them. But they gave us the tube finally, and unfortunately all the writing on the tube was in Japanese. So we still couldn't establish what was in the substance that was given to the horse. And if we weren't satisfied or couldn't establish, we would have had to scratch the horse. And you can be sure if we did that, Delta Blues and Pop Rock wouldn't have Cornell the Melbourne Cup the following year. But John McCaffrey got a hold of somebody from the equine centre that was involved in the exportation and importation of horses, and half an hour before the race he established that it was nothing more than a Vaseline which contained no prohibited substances. So half an hour before the Melbourne Cup we gave permission for the horse to run. We took a swab sample from it that was negative, but we did fine the trainer $5,000 for breaching the rule, in fact by giving the horse a treatment on race day which was banned under our rules. But all's well that ends well, and we finally found the interpreter, and he was in the champagne bar drinking champagne trying to chat up a couple of Australian girls before the job was done. And that was, it just highlighted the difficulties associated with international involvement in the Cup at that time, where the rules from racing jurisdictions varied considerably. And initially after that time I was appointed chairman of the International Harmonisation of Rules Committee, and we're still trying to get uniformity in racing in rules right around the world, which ultimately will occur, but it hasn't occurred yet and will take time. In relation to the Cup, I was fortunate enough to work at 30, and I've seen some marvellous races during that time. R1 won the first cup that I worked on and beat Hyperno Salamander by a short half head. Tommy Hughes, trainer of Salamander, was very disappointed in getting beaten, and he said to me later that if it had run, he'd have bought Melbourne. He had that much money on the line for Salamander and got beaten by a short half head by Hyperno, ridden by Harry White. I was also there when Kiwi barnstormed from last at the 800 metres to win, ridden by a very fresh-faced Jim Cassidy. I was there for the first protest in 130 years of running of the Cup when Shivers Revenge ran second to Let's Elope, and Shane Dye lodged an objection against Let's Elope, and there was significant interference, but the margin of 2 3/4 lengths meant that the stewards couldn't be satisfied that it affected the result, and the protest was dismissed. And incidentally, Bart Cummings trained both, and he walked into the steward's room with a smile on his face and said, "I don't care what you do, I got them both." So the protest was dismissed, but I was there when Mackay Diva did something that we'll never see again. Mackay Diva won 3 Melbourne Cups in the history of running of the race, 161 runnings. Only one horse has ever won it 3 times, and that was the great mare Mackay Diva. I was there when the Japanese Quinella, of course, in 2006 with Delta Blues and Pop Rock. That was an amazing race, and it once again highlighted that it truly was an international race. But the highlight of my working career was 2002 when Media Puzzle, ridden by Damien Oliver, won the race, and we all know that Damien's brother Jason was tragically killed in the week before the Melbourne Cup, and Damien had so much pressure on him in the week leading up to the race, and as chairman of stewards I had dealings with him, and often I spoke to him 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 times a day in the week leading up to the day, in the days leading up to the Derby, offering all the support that we could, and asking him whether he could ride or whether he didn't. Whichever decision he decided to make, we'd support it. We just needed to let the connections know, and he said, "Look, I'll be over there on Derby Day. I think I'll be right, and I'll be doing it for Jason." Well, he rode on Derby Day, in his own words, terribly. He had 5 or 6 rides and didn't run a place. He wasn't in the right frame of mind, clearly, on Derby Day. And I remember going into the jockey's room after the last, and I sat down beside him and said, I didn't tell him that he rode badly, he told me. So he said, "Look, I just wasn't right today, and I think I'll have to go back to Perth. I don't think I'll be able to fulfil my engagement on Tuesday in the frame of mind I am." And we fully understood it. A huge burden on Damien's shoulders, thinking of his lost brother who passed away only a couple of days before. And I said to him, "Well, whatever decision you make, if you can let us know tomorrow, we'll make it public and we'll support whatever decision you make." And on the Sunday morning, about 11 o'clock, the phone rang, and it was Damien. It was a different Damien Oliver. He was chirpy and he was up and about, and he said, "Look, I got a message from Jason last night," and he gave me a kick up the backside and said, "Get out there and do your best." So he said, "I'll be there Tuesday, and hopefully I'll be in a better position than I was on Derby Day." Well, history shows that it was one of the most emotional days racing that we've ever had anything to do with, when Damien rode Media Puzzle, and he gave it the perfect ride. He smothered it up just behind the leaders throughout the race, the absolutely A1 perfect position. And somehow, coming to the home turn, he extricated himself from that position and kicked to the front at the top of the straight and kicked away. And I watched the races from the clock tower, and as I said earlier, that it's the only time in my career that as it went past the clock tower 120 metres from home, I gave the horse a kick in the ribs to make sure it would go on and get the job done, which it did. And the reception that he received after that race was huge relief when people, instead of throwing champagne glasses and roses in the air, they just stood and applauded, which was just a marvellous racing moment and a marvellous sporting moment. And I was standing there waiting for him to come back to scale. His wife was there, and his manager and all his friends were in tears. It was just a very emotional day, and Patrick Smith, who was one of the leading reporters at the time, said to me, he had tears in his eyes as well, he said to me, "Well, that must have got to you, Chief." And I said, "No, Patrick, it's not over yet. What if he weighs in light or there's a protest?" And he said, typical bloody Stewart. So he didn't weigh in light, and there wasn't a protest. But when he handed me his whip and skull cap and weighed in, he leaned over and he just said, "Thanks for all your support." And that was the end of me then. I was like the rest of the crowd, tears running down my cheek. But it was an amazing moment, and it was a moment that I'll never forget. And 35 years stewarding, it's something that will remain with me forever.
Thanks for sharing, Jess. Now, James, pleasure to have you here today. A rich racing background with the family. Can you shed some light on that and some of the champions they've had over the years?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jackson, and just like to say thank you very much to Dave and Amelia and everyone at Kaimai for having us here today on such a beautiful day, and also to Des and Jackson and the BRC for showing the cup off. It's fantastic to see one of the great sporting trophies of the world here, and a fitting setting, particularly because Gundagai is such a strong racing community. Only a small town, 2,000 people, but Gundagai and everything racing certainly punches above their weight, and we've got to give the club a plug. We've got a 7-race card this Sunday. So, and then of course, as Dave mentioned before, the Snake Gully Cup's coming up in November 17 and 18. 2 great days of racing there, and so it's a big month, November, for racing in Australia. The Melbourne Cup Carnival and the Snake Gully Cup Carnival. So. But just in terms of the history of my family, I live at Gunong Jugraw. It's a property on the river, on the Murrumbidgee between Coolac and Jugiong, and I live there with my wife Meredith and my kids, and a magnificent property, which came to the family in I think just before the Second World War. But the family's history probably dates back before that, probably over 100 years. My great-grandfather, Peter Tate, who was originally from Queensland, he was a very keen racing man, and bred and raced horses, and I think he was maybe a committeeman of the AJC committee later in life, probably in the 40s and 50s. And now his first really good horse of note was a horse called Balliard, who won the Newmarket Handicap back in 1925, which was down the straight 6 at Flemington. And interestingly, he was strapped. I just can't remember the trainer, but he was strapped by a fellow called Phil Lotta, who went on to train for my grandparents. And Phil Lotta was born in 1900. He was an Italian immigrant. He came out to Australia at the age of 7, and then went into I think was an apprentice jockey, and then he was obviously strapping Balliard on that day. And then he went on to train, I think, for Peter Tate, my great grandfather, and then for my grandparents, Daisy and Griff Tate. And a Melbourne Cup story there, I think a Melbourne Cup connection to Peter Tate and Phil Lotta. Peter Tate had a horse, Indian Chief, in 1950, and he was a very good star. He ran second in the Metropolitan, I think, which was a great lead-up race. Probably still is a good lead-up race to the Cup, and probably even more so back in those days. And Indian Chief just got beaten in the Metropolitan, then I think he went to Melbourne in 1950 and ran in the Caulfield Cup, and I think may have run in the Moonee Valley Cup. I'm not sure if he won that or not, but he did run in the Melbourne Cup with George Moore aboard. George Moore would have been early. I suppose George Moore was one of the greatest jockeys of all time, and it would be the sort of James McDonald of his day. And George Moore rode Indian Chief, and the story that I had heard that Indian Chief was he was third into the straight. There was 3 of them into the straight, and there was only 3 of them in the running, and unfortunately he fell, Indian Chief, down the running. But he was okay though. I think he went on to possibly have a career as a stallion in Queensland, siring stock horses and country race horses. And George Moore he obviously went from strength to strength there to be the greatest jockey in Australia and one of the great jockeys in the world. And I think he may have broken a collarbone. But it's interesting. I looked I heard that story from my dad, Sandy Tate, and that he was third to the straight. Now I looked on YouTube, and you can actually see the race, and he actually fell looked like he fell at the 200, and he wasn't actually running third. He was going backwards and running 8th. So, but it was a good story, and I think he was going backwards, and he in about 8th position, but. I think I'll stick with the original story, third into the straight, and would have run a place for sure. So, and then he, I think the other George Moore. Actually, yeah, just looking at the ride, being a sort of a foremanless and looking at the videos, which you probably couldn't do it that day. I think George probably wasn't one of George's greatest rides. He looked like he was. The poor old Indian chief was doing plenty of work down the straight the first time. So, but obviously George went from strength to strength after that. So that, and then Phil Alotta was the trainer of Indian Chief. And then he went on to train for my grandparents, Griffin Daisy Tate, through the 60s and 70s, and they had some great success. They won a horse called In Love. It traces back to a bloodline which my father Sandy still has, and I think that traces back to his grandfather, his mother's father, Oliver Osborne. The Osbornes were a big family in the area back for a long period of time, and I think In Love traces back to a bloodline started by Oliver Osborne, and he won the Doomben 10,000 in the 60s. I think it ran probably second in the Epsom and second in the Doncaster, and then they purchased. My grandfather Griff Tate purchased a horse, a mare Dark Jewel, off a friend of his, cousin of my grandmother's, Pat Osborne, and Dark Jewel turned out to be just a champion broodmare. I think she had 11 to foal, 10 winners, and some champions, like she had Cabochon in the late 60s, won the Stradbroke and the Epsom, and second in a couple of Doncasters. Birthright, who won there were three. There was a great 2-year-old race, the Maribyrnong Plate, run down the straight, and still is at Flemington, and I think three full siblings won that same race as a 2-year-old in the spring, which would have been Baguette, Heirloom and Birthright. So Birthright was a very good sprinter. Heirloom was she won the 1,000 Guineas and the Maribyrnong Plate, and was second in a lot of big races. Betelgeuse was a great sprinter, and then Baguette, who was a champion, absolute champion. Baguette, he won the Triple Crown as a 2-year-old Triple Crown, the Golden Slipper, the Size Produce, the Champagne. He was unbeaten as a 2-year-old. He won 7 from 7, and then he won the. Then he came back as a 3-year-old. I think they tried him over longer distance. He wasn't a stayer, and then he came back and he won the Newmarket as a 3-year-old with a record weight, and then he went up and won the Doomben 10,000. Then he was, I think when he retired, he was close to the highest. He probably retired in the early 70s. I think he would have been close to the highest stake earner racing around that time. And then I think he was sold for very good money to start, but it would just pale in comparison. A horse like that would be worthy of an enormous amount of money these days for his record, particularly as a 2-year-old. But then you wouldn't know that they get bundled off to start so early these days, So, I mean, you'd never see a horse like that running a Triple Crown winner these days. You'd never see them getting beaten and running as a 4-year-old. But so they had a great association with Phil Alotta, and then had horses trained by Graham Nevillebeck. They had a filly called Off Two Cities who ran third to the great mare Surround and the Oaks and the AJC Oaks and the VRC Oaks. And then Graham Begg took over the training of the horses in I think the very late 80s, early 90s. And my grandparents had a filly there called Whisk, who was an outstanding 2-year-old filly. She ran in the big races, I think third in the Size and the Champagne, and then came back. And then I think Nevillebeck was the trainer. He then went on to Hong Kong. Graham took over the training of Whisk, and she was, nearly the best 3-year-old filly. She won the 1,000 Guineas, second in the Oaks, absolutely brilliant on a day. And then my grandparents died in the early 90s, and then the ownership of most of the horses went to my father Sandy and his sister Jill Nivison, who lives at Walker, and they took over the ownership of Whisk, and Dad was the managing part owner. He sent a couple of mares by Whiskey Road, Whisk, the great filly, and one called Highlight. Sent them over to New Zealand I suppose it would have been in the early 90s, to Nassapur, who was the great staying sire at the time. As Des mentioned before about the Bart Cummings Quinella, the Bletzer label Shiver's Revenge, I think they were both by Nassapur. So he was a great sire of stayers, and the resultant foal out of Whisk was Tie the Knot. And then I think the one out of Highlights was a mare called Accent. Accent maybe won a couple of races around here and quite a few placings at Wagga. And Tie the Knot ended up winning 21 races from 62 starts and 13 Group 1s, and it was an absolute champion. And I suppose in terms of the Melbourne Cup story with Tie the Knot, he showed a lot of. He went to Guy Walter. He was trained by Guy Walter, and he would have gone there in probably 1996 and started racing in 1997 as a 2-year-old. He won at Randwick as a late 2-year-old and then went on a campaign to Melbourne. He won the Spring Champion Stakes, Group 1, over 2,000 for 3-year-olds. Then he went down to Melbourne that spring and he ran second in the VRC Derby behind Second Coming. And it was quite I suppose being biased, it was a bit of a biased track, so he didn't get the conditions to suit that day, but he ran a great race. It was interesting, Des was talking about Damien Oliver. I think Damien Oliver in that day was on another horse, a grey horse, and may have bumped into, because Tiger not being the favourite of the New South Wales horse, I think Damien Oliver rode into him and tried to put him off, and he may have actually got a suspension out of it. So there was no favours being paid to tie the knot sort of thing. And so then he came back in the autumn and had a great campaign, won the Rosehill Guineas. He was an unlucky second in the Derby, and then he won the Sydney Cup. So that put him on the track. He won the Sydney Cup beating Doremus, who was a great 2-miler, who won the Melbourne Cup once brilliantly and a Caulfield Cup, and I think had just been beaten the previous spring. Doremus had been beaten a nose by in a great Melbourne Cup behind Might and Power. And so that was a great thing for Tiger not to win the Sydney Cup beating Doremus. And then he went on the Melbourne Cup trial that spring, ran in the traditional lead-ups. I think he ran in the Warwick Stakes and the Chelmsford Stakes in Sydney. I think he ran third to Might and Power in the Chelmsford. And then he went to Melbourne for the Underwood Stakes, which is the traditional path for those sort of horses that are, going through the weight for age races. And he went in the Underwood, and I've never been down there. It was a big field, probably a field of 14 or 15. Shane Dye was aboard, and he went back to near last. He just came down the outside and absolutely brilliant performance. One of his great wins, Shane Dye in the saddle, and I think he beat Jezebel, the Melbourne Cup winner of that year. And then he ran the Caulfield Cup, and this was probably just the start of the international era, and an English horse called Torphin's Melody won the Cup. There's quite a bit of interference. Tyler Knob ran very well. He ran third, beaten about half a length. And then he went to the McKinnon Stakes on the Saturday, ran fourth, ran well, but the track probably didn't suit him that day. And then he went to the Melbourne Cup, and he drew the outside barrier. Shane Dye was in the saddle. He went back to last, and I've watched the replay a number of times, and he started to make ground before the turn. He got to within probably 6 lengths of the lead. He was going really well, and then there was a bit of interference up front, and he just got held up, and ended up when they went into the straight, he was 12 off the lead, and then he flew home to be beaten 3 lengths, and he certainly would have been, with a fair run, I'm sure he would have gone close. And I spoke to Des about this today. I remember going in the steward's room on the Thursday with Guy Walter and his wife Wendy and my parents Sandy and Kathy and my brother Ollie, and we went in and visited. We went and had a look at the stewards footage of that of the race, and you remember Des saying what a great run it was, and maybe not certainly wasn't Irish Dye's greatest ride. But Shane Dye, or Raymond Shane Dye, is one of the great characters of racing. He's a great jockey, and he was certainly opinionated and super confident. Tiger Knot had a big fan base here at Gundagai at the time, but certainly Shane Dye's fan base here at Gundagai wasn't quite as high, particularly after that Melbourne Cup. So, and then Tiger Knot, he continued on his run, and he won the Tancred and the Sydney Cup. He won the Sydney Cup for the second time the next year by about 7 lengths, brilliantly, and won the BMW. And he was at the height of his powers then. And then he went back to Melbourne in the spring for another crack at the Melbourne Cup. And he never really went as well in Melbourne as Sydney. He probably didn't, that way of going, he probably didn't travel quite as well. But he still ran some great races. And he ran second to Sunline in the Cox Plate that year. And she was one of the greatest mares of all time. And then he went to the McKinnon, was disappointing. He probably had enough, and he ran 13th in Rogan Josh's Cup. So that was the last time he ran in the Melbourne Cup. But he went on to win, I think, he still ran for another, that was as a 5-year-old, so he still ran as a 6 and 7-year-old, and still managed to win about another 5 or 6 Group 1s. So he's an incredible horse, versatile and incredible longevity. I think he won the Expressway Group 2 at 1200 and 2 Sydney Cups, and he won 4 Chipping Nortons, and it was just to have an association with him, and following him around was just an incredible thrill to sort of be involved in going to the Melbourne Cup and all those lead-up races, the big races in Australia. So, you know, it's something I'll never forget. You know, being involved with Tie the Knot, and since then, my other great horse we had was a mare called Spinning Hill, owned by my father Sandy, my aunt Jill, and she was a fantastic sprinter. Won the Manikato Stakes a couple of times down in Melbourne. Won the Lightning over 1,000 metres down the straight. I think she was beaten a half length by Schwarzier in the Lightning down the straight, and I think he went on and won the double in England, the King Stan, the Golden Jubilee that same year. And she again raced till she was 7. It's just a pity she's not around now. I'm sure she'd create plenty of interest from the Everest slot holders. So, yeah. But and since then we're still racing and breeding quite a lot. My brother Ollie's got a Twin Hill stud there over at Cootamundra, so he's with his wife Amber and kids, and they're into breeding and the commercial side of things in a very big way, with 5 stallions standing there, Dormier and New Stallion with Peltzer, and Proven Stallion Smart Missile, Denman and Odyssey Moon, and my mum and dad and my aunt Jill, they're still breeding horses. They had recently had Sherry Tortoni, who's been a really good horse, actually a nephew. He'd be a nephew of Tie the Knot, and I actually saw him. I fed him this morning, and he's a very tall horse, and there's a bit of a likeness there to Tie the Knot. But he won the Vars as a 3-year-old, ran 4th in the VRC Derby, and won some other really good races. I think he won $1 million in prize money, so he's a fantastic horse. And so yeah, we're still breeding. I've got to breed a few myself with Ollie and a few mates, and we had a horse, Jojo Was a Man, who won 4 at Randwick last year. So he went 4 at Randwick on a Saturday last year. I mean, if you can win at Randwick on a Saturday, it's good. Do it 4 times, that's fantastic. So that's basically how it's going, the racing goes.
Thanks for sharing, James. Amazing racing history there. One last question, Des. You retired in 2008. Since then, you've been a Melbourne Cup ambassador on our tours. Can you share us a little bit about the tours you've been on and what it means to really get out in the